Hi there, welcome back to another lesson in APUS history. Today we're going to be addressing the Mexican-American War. Your learning objective, which you should stay focused on throughout this entire lesson, is to explain the causes and effects of the Mexican-American War. And then there's really two key concepts that are addressed by the College Board. The United States was able to add large territories in the West through victory in the Mexican-American War and diplomatic negotiations, raising questions about the status of slavery, American Indians, and Mexicans in the newly acquired lands. And then the next key concept furthers that by talking about how the U.S. government interaction and conflict with Mexican Americans and American Indians increased in regions newly taken from American Indians in Mexico, altering these groups' economic self sufficiency and cultures. So, for this lesson, I'm going to be giving you a brief historical context, describe the conflict with Mexico, what were the causes, what were the debates that ensued, and the effects, and then what were the experiences in the West for Mexicans and American Indians. So, to start, let's do a quick recap of the election of 1844. In the election of 1844, there's really two primary things to pay attention to. What was the election focused on, and what were the political parties believing about that? So, the focus is on foreign policy or manifest destiny. Polk, the Democrat, is pro expansion. He is in favor of manifest destiny. He wants to expand the continent all the way to the coast. And Henry Clay is a Whig. He's largely opposed to the expansion, and this is primarily due to the issue of slavery. So Polk wins this election. He becomes the 11th president of the United States, and part of that expansionist platform was all about Texas and Oregon. And so when he wins this, Polk and Congress interpret this win as an endorsement for expansion. And so between the time he was elected to when he actually came into office, Texas was actually annexed. This is a primary cause of the war with Mexico. So prior to this election, Mexico had warned that if the U.S. officially annexed Texas, then that would mean war. So upon the annexation, Mexico sends an ambassador to Washington and they declare it as an act of aggression and then sever diplomatic ties. And then there were additional disagreements over what the correct boundary of Texas actually was. Was it the Nueces River or the Rio Grande? And so those two rivers created a huge amount of disputed territory that both Texas and Mexico claimed as their own. So, additionally, during this time, Polk is going to send John Slidell to Mexico, and he has two goals. His mission is to persuade Mexico to sell California and New Mexico and to settle that disputed border of Texas. But his mission fails. He's not able to negotiate. So, while they're waiting for these negotiations to take place, Polk is going to send General Zachary Taylor to cross the Louisiana and Texas border. And his orders are to approach as near the boundary line, the Rio Grande, as prudence will dictate. So Taylor's army is going to cross over Louisiana and start approaching the Rio Grande. And they wait for the Mexican army to cross the Rio Grande. Now remember, this territory was claimed by both Texas and Mexico. So for Mexico to cross the Rio Grande, they view that as their own territory. But the Americans also viewed it as their own territory because of the annexation that had just occurred. So on April 26, 1846, Mexicans do cross over the Rio Grande and 11 Americans are killed in battle. On May 13th, Congress is going to declare war. But here is Polk's message to Congress. He says, Mexico has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. War exists by the act of Mexico herself. Now, not everyone was in support of the war. Many Whigs opposed it, but were fearful of voting against it in Congress because they would appear unpatriotic. Democrats had pressure to appear unified with their newly elected president. And some were against the war because they viewed it purely as a fight for slavery. These new lands, specifically Texas, already had slavery there, and they did not want to expand slavery. A lieutenant colonel in Taylor's army said this: "It looks as if the government sent a small force on purpose to bring on a war, so as to have a pretext for taking California and as much of this country as it chooses." And so Hitchcock is basically saying this is kind of immoral what has happened here. Henry David Thoreau, he's the author of Civil Disobedience. He also viewed the war as immoral, and he refused to pay his taxes as an act of rebellion against the government. He ends up becoming an incredibly famous opponent of the war, and others will kind of follow his lead. But one of the most famous things that happens in the opposition to the war is the spot resolutions. So Abraham Lincoln, an Illinois senator at the time, he questions the spot where blood was really shed. And so he wrote up resolutions that would force Polk to provide the location where this blood was shed. And this was all due to the fear that Polk was trying to extend slavery. These resolutions weren't really acted on by Congress, but did earn Lincoln the nickname Spotty Lincoln. So here's a quote by Lincoln. He said that he believed that Polk was deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he ordered Zachary Taylor in the midst of peaceful Mexican settlement purposely to bring on a war. So what happens in the war is not nearly as important for your learning objective as the causes and the facts. So the Americans will possess more advanced weaponry. However, they will be more affected by the heat and disease. They utilized the Navy to completely block Mexican trade. And there was a victory pretty early into the war that led to an official truce. However, the Mexican government did not agree to this truce and they refused to negotiate peace. And so it wasn't until the following March that they surrendered after a major battle in Mexico City. So, what are the effects of this war? Well, it is going to lead to changes in territory, massive changes in territory. Specifically, Mexican residents who were part of the Mexican empire or were part of the Mexican country are now located within the United States. California is going to have temporary independence. They're going to call themselves the Bear Flag Republic. This is going to lead to the fulfillment of manifest destiny. And then an additional piece that will come in is going to be the Gadsden Purchase that will complete the continental United States. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this is going to be the major aspect of the effects of the war with Mexico. The American diplomat Trist is going to be sent to negotiate this treaty, and he's going to tell his wife that he's asking for the minimum because he is ashamed of the inequity of the war and the abuse of power on our part. So he doesn't even really agree with the war, and so he gives Mexico kind of a minimum. And Polk is trying to replace Trist to get a more aggressive negotiator. And Trist warns the Mexican government and says, you're going to want to negotiate with me because the next person who comes is going to create more harsher restrictions on your land. So Trist does get the treaty negotiated, which was Polk was furious about it. He wanted much more land than Trist got. But all of Texas, with the border being the Rio Grande, the Mexican cession, which you can see in that map, all those lands were now given to the United States. And then the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million. Again, Whigs were opposed to this treaty because of the issue of slavery. So here's a map of the United States showing kind of the land gains over time. But by 1853, with that Gadsden Purchase, the continental United States was complete. So moving on here, what was the Mexican experience in the West? So this is going to be general. These are going to be the Mexicans who were in the Mexican cession that now became part of the United States. So many of them resisted American rule through armed rebellions. The treaty had massive impacts on their life, including loss of life, property, and culture. Approximately 90,000 Mexican citizens are now American citizens, but some will move out of the Mexican cession into the new Mexican boundaries to maintain their citizenship. Californios will become a quick minority in the territory. This is similar to the Tejanos in Texas. And the U.S. Land Commission is going to challenge the Mexican land grants from the treaty. So the Mexicans living in the Mexican cession were promised that they would get to keep their property and be able to continue to practice their religion in the way that they wanted. But this commission is created and basically negates those promises. Some were able to maintain their political influence, for example, in New Mexico. Some made fortunes from the new economy, but many Mexican Americans became the subject of violence, and they fought back against these vigilante groups and lynchings that began to really attack their way of life. A Mexican leader, Mariano Vallejo, said, Legal thieves, clothed in the robes of the law, took from us our lands and our houses, and without the least scruple enthroned themselves in our homes like so many powerful kings. The American Indian experience in the West. This is going to be somewhat similar to the Mexicans, but you should not think of these groups as being necessarily allied. There were conflicts between these groups as well. So the gold rush had increased violence against American Indians, and territories that were home to many American Indian groups, like you can see in the map there, were now claimed by the U.S. But really, the native politics that were happening in this region have been largely ignored by historians. If this is a topic that interests you, I highly encourage you to read Violence Over the Land by Ned Blackhawk. I have a book review video that you can watch that kind of introduces this book for you. But really, as a result of this war, it's going to be a continuation of portrayals of American Indians as either bloodthirsty predators or pitiful wayward children. And that's in opposition to the way that they should have been viewed as sovereign political communities that should have had proper negotiations or respectful interactions. So the American Indian experience is going to be in some ways similar to Mexicans in the areas of violence and land being taken from them. However, the Mexican government did represent the Mexican citizens, whereas American Indians were not represented in the least in these negotiations. So that concludes our lesson here. Hopefully by now you can absolutely specifically address the causes and effects of the Mexican-American War. And thank you for watching. And if this video was helpful, please like and subscribe.